I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the old ceremonial hunting tradition of eating the heart out of the first animal you kill. Meat from those organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. You can get those same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And remember, use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase. There's nothing like snook hook sets at dawn or catching a tarpon in the moonlight. Find your next fishing trip made easy on fishingbooker.com and experience the magic of the Sunshine State or any other destination on your fishing bucket list. Book a blue water adventure in search of sailfish or go snapper fishing with the kids. With over 6,000 captains and trips to choose from, planning your next one just got a whole lot easier. Download the Fishing Booker app on the Google Play or App Store or visit them online at fishingbooker.com to book your trip today.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, your home for deer hunting news, stories, and strategies. And now, your host, Mark Kenyon.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. I'm your host, Mark Kenyon. This is episode number 138. Today in the show, we're joined by expert shed hunter and author Joe Shead. And as you might have guessed, we're talking shed hunting. All right, welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, brought to you by Sitka Gear. And today we are talking shed hunting, and we're joined by the man who literally wrote the book on shed hunting. And I kid you not, Dan, the guy's name is Joe Shead. Right?
It almost sounds fake.
Well, what I've wondered is, like, did he go out and change his name because he wanted to be a shed hunting guy, or was it fate? Did fate destine him to write a book on shed hunting? I don't know which it is, but
I don't know.
But Joe's an avid shed hunter.
Is he the first guy to ever go shed hunting?
I doubt that.
You don't think so?
But you can ask him when we get him on.
Huh.
I'll let you ask that question.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, so Joe is an avid, possibly the first shed hunter. He's a past contributor to Deer and Deer Hunting magazine. And like I said, he wrote the book on shed hunting called Shed Hunting, A Guide to Finding White-tailed Deer Antlers. So in a few minutes here, we're going to get him on the line, and we're going to go deep into everything he knows about finding antlers. And I'm pretty pumped about that. I don't know about you, Dan, but this is that time of year where, the shed itch is needs to be scratched, right?
Right. Amen. Like, I need to just go for a long 8-hour walk.
Mm-hmm. There's something, it's fun to actually be out there looking for sheds, but then also, at least for me, usually that's the first opportunity I get for some serious outdoor time in like a month or so, other than some little scouting trips and stuff. A good full day of shed hunting is just like a little bit healing for the soul, right?
Right. Just, beat cabin fever a little bit and get out there. And I remember me and my buddy Ryan, it was in 2012, I think we went out on a shed hunt. He had a little girl at home, and my wife was just getting ready to have our first child, and we found a day that worked for both of us, and we went out, and it was like 10 degrees that day in February, and we still went out, and we still pounded the ground.
You're doing it no matter what.
Yeah, no matter what. So we pounded the ground, came away with a couple sheds, but most importantly, we got to go outside.
Yeah, much needed at this time of year. I've definitely got cabin fever. Have you got out walking at all yet?
Come on, Mark.
Okay.
what kind of question is that? You're talking to a guy who went hunting one time from November 3rd to January 10th.
I was trying to give you the benefit of the doubt.
well, don't do that next time.
All right, my bad. What about this? Do you have a game plan for when you will go out for the first time?
Yeah, it's gonna be really soon. One of my farms really close to the house, This weekend, I'm actually going to pick up my mount.
Wow.
It's done. Yep, it's done already.
Quick.
Yep. And while I'm down in that neck of the woods, I'm going to go out near one of my farms that I hunt, and I'm going to be talking to a new landowner to ask permission to shed hunt and turkey hunt this spring. And hopefully that might lead into the whitetail season, bow hunting, because that piece of property is next to another awesome piece of property that I know I can't hunt, because the farmer who owns that property is a big time hunter, him and his family bow hunt, but the land next to it, it's kind of some scrub ground. And you know how the rut is, man. Those big bucks will take a cruise every once in a while into some of these not so, sought after pieces. And those are the pieces that I like.
Yeah. You bring up a good point, and I know we've talked about it in past episodes over the last few years, but, this is such a great time to get shed hunting permission and establish that relationship, which can someday lead to hunting permission maybe. I mean, even if you're not like a shed hunting addict, you should start doing it simply, if for no other reason, to try to eventually lead to some possible new hunting spots, because it's a really, really good way to at least, introduce yourself to people and get that conversation started.
Amen. And I'll be doing a lot of it.
Yeah.
I think this year in particularly, I don't know how much longer I'm going to have my main farm. It may only be 5 years, but I need to start striking some relationships with some new farmers, and this is the time of year to do it. So
why do you say that you're not sure about how long you'll be able to hunt the current spot? Is there some new information that makes you think that way, or?
It's getting to the point where the landowner is to an age where she even mentioned, she's like, I don't know how much longer I'm going to do this, or how much longer it's going to be in the family. It might be sold within, because I'm not really sure how old she is. I've never asked, but she's in her 60s if I had to guess. And she's starting to get rid of some of her livestock because it's just too much work for her. And that kind of leads to, the next step, which is no livestock and just cash renting out the farm. But she's got like 5 sisters or 5 siblings. And, when it comes to a kind of a scenario like that, half of them or a majority of them who don't like the farm life, they just want that money.
Yeah. And
they're going to sell it and split up the money, if I had to guess, and go from there. And then, typically what will happen is either a rich farmer, or I shouldn't say rich, but a farmer will come in and buy the ground for their livestock and their crops, or it's going to get purchased by someone who is all about the hunting, and then they'll cash rent that to the as well, and then adios to me and the other guys that hunt that piece.
Well, what you got to do is you got to start saving your pennies, Dan, and then buy that son of a gun.
Yep. Abracadabra.
Yeah, just easy as that, right?
Hey, I'm going to give you $15 for 480 acres. You cool with that?
Wouldn't it be nice to be independently wealthy?
Oh man, I'm trying. Maybe you should sell. How much do you think you could sell Wired to Hunt for right now? Like 15 mil?
Not nearly as much as I wish I could. Not nearly enough, that's for sure. Yeah, that's.
But shed hunting. Back to shed hunting, man.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but I think you were getting ready to say it's like a mind cleanse.
Yeah. It's just good to get out there, and at least for me, at least for 90% of the time, there are those times like after you shed hunted for like 10 straight hours and you haven't seen a thing, then you sometimes start to wander, I feel like. But lots of times when I'm shed hunting, you're so focused on searching for that bone, just constantly scanning, looking, it takes your mind off of all the other things going on in your life that maybe could be stressing you out or worrying you or anything like that. It's just a great way to get out there in fresh air and just be in a zone. Right. And that's pretty nice.
The other cool thing about shed hunting is, let's say you go out and you do a huge push. That night, you're sleeping like a baby. Mm-hmm. I love just going out and getting exhausted and then going home and crashing.
Yeah, I agree. I've been holding off on going out too. I'm just as bad as you. I haven't really done any shed hunting yet because, I don't have a ton of spots here in Michigan that I can go, so I've been trying to wait till most of those antlers are hopefully on the ground. And with this mild winter we've had, I think, at least in places where they have milder weather, we're probably going to possibly have a later antler drop for some deer too, or at least more scattered. I'm sure Joe will talk about this a little bit, but I don't know what you've seen, Dan, but from what I've seen, it seems like when you've got those really hard, cold, snowy winters, the antlers tend to fall a little bit earlier, and they tend to be more concentrated, around the couple core food sources or whatever. But when it's kind of snowless and mild, like at least it's been here in Michigan, I kind of worry that's going to make it kind of tough. Those antlers are going to be all over the place, and, it's going to be hard to know when they've dropped. I've lost pretty much all the bucks off of my property, my main Michigan property. There's nothing on trail camera anymore. So all the food sources have dried up in the area. My food plots actually got flooded. We had a ton of rain, and so all the food's covered in water. It's now covered in snow. But I think that definitely hurt the activity, and so I'm actually going to start driving around the roads here in the evening and try to relocate where some of these bucks might be now. This time of year, they can move half a mile, mile and a half away to find where that best food is. So I'm kind of hoping maybe I can relocate some of these bucks and get permission there maybe. So that's like my next week and a half. That's my project.
Awesome.
So,
well, good luck with that.
Thank you. I want to mention one thing before we get Joe on. I had a really cool experience this past weekend. We had, and as you know, Dan, and I'm sure a lot of people who've been following both you or I on social media, or really a lot of people on social media, there's a lot of talk recently about the public lands transfer movement, which we've talked a lot about, and how that's a really bad idea. Well, this past weekend, our Michigan chapter of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, of which I'm a board member, we had an event in southwestern Michigan. We had a pint night, and we had, somewhere around maybe 50 different guys and girls come down to have some beers and talk about public lands and talk about what we can do to try to protect these places. And it was a really, really cool opportunity to get to see people rallying together like that. And I really enjoyed that. And I got to meet some Wired to Hunt listeners and followers, which was really cool. Lots of people were wondering why you weren't there, Dan.
I don't live in Michigan.
Why didn't Dan make the drive from Michigan to Michigan? But it was cool. So that was fun. And the one other shout out I want to make about that event and about the topic in general is right now there is a bill that has been proposed. Last week was proposed. Dan, you've heard, we've been talking about it. H.R. 621 proposes the sale of 3.1 million acres, I believe, of public lands. Straight up, they're not even talking about transferring it. It's just saying we want to sell over 3 million acres of these public lands. So if you're not familiar with this whole deal, you can go back and listen to our podcast with Randy Newberg about it, or you can go and search on Google or on Wired to Hunt. There's lots of stuff I've written about it in the past, talking about why this whole thing is a really bad idea. But either way, go and send an email or make a phone call to your congressman or woman. Right, Dan, you've done that. You reached out to some of your reps?
All of them.
Yeah.
Even the Utah senator, or the Utah congressman who proposed the bill. I've reached out to that office as well.
Yeah, I think that guy has got lit up because a lot of people are sharing his Instagram account and stuff, and he's getting
rightfully
lots of comments.
so.
Yeah, it's funny. I called my representative here for our congressional district that I live in. I called his office in Washington and his local Michigan office, and I sent an email. And then, like the next day, I got an email from a guy who said he's a big follower of Wired to Hunt, and he also happens to be the nephew of my representative.
Oh, nice.
So he's like, you probably have been calling my uncle. So I need to respond to that guy and say, yes, I have been calling your uncle.
Right.
So that was kind of a funny small world type thing. So hopefully if you're listening, talk to your uncle about how this is not a good idea. This is not a good idea. So that's all for my little public land PSA, unless you got anything else, Dan.
I just, this is a light-hearted conversation between me and you, but the action that needs to be taken on this should not be lighthearted. This is This is a real serious problem, because what happens is a law like this is passed, and so everybody thinks, oh, it's out west. How is this going to affect me? I'm an East Coast person. Well, if you hunt public land, period, this is going to show other states what they can do, and it could snowball. And imagine a United States with no public land, right? So this just isn't a Western issue, because states like Michigan, their representatives and congressmen, they're going to vote on this. Mm-hmm. So it's very important for every person in every state to take action. And when I mean take action, I don't mean share a Facebook post. I mean call, email, voice your opinion.
Yep. And to your point, Dan, while this law or this proposal last week that we're talking about, 621, that specifically mentions a slew of Western states. There have been proposals that are applying the same type of logic to all states. There was one that was proposed last summer where they were essentially were asking to give every state permission to sell 2 million acres of federal public lands, or the maximum amount of public lands they have if it's underneath that limit. So there's all sorts of stuff coming out like this. It's been happening for a while now. It continues to build steam, and it's a really bad, poorly thought idea that some people with a lot of money and interest in trying to exploit these lands are trying to push through. So hunters, anglers, campers, hikers, rafters, wildlife watchers, bird watchers, we all need to step up on this one, because to your point, imagine this country without public lands, whether it's a spot to deer hunt or a place to go take your kids to go see wildlife, or somewhere to camp
boat
someday.
Access.
I mean, these things are they don't come back if we let them get away. If we let them be developed or sold, we are never getting them back. So that's that. We'll definitely be talking more about it in the future too. We've got some episodes where we'll be solely talking about some things like that. So I think with that said, we'll move on back to shed hunting though. And we'll talk some fun stuff about antlers. So let's take a quick break here to thank our partners at Sitka Gear, and then we will give Joe a call. All right, well, some of you might recall us mentioning a few weeks ago that Sitka Gear is launching a new line of clothing specifically for female hunters. And so for our Sitka story today, I thought we'd bring on Jess DeLorenzo, an avid whitetail hunter who was recruited to be a part of that process for the new female-specific gear, and hear from her just a bit about what it was like to be a part of that.
Well, when they first approached me about it, I mean, I was ecstatic to be involved, because that was like my number one want. I just wanted Sitka gear that was made for women as far as the fit and things like that. So when they told me that they were going to give it a go and were going to let me be involved with it, I was super excited. And they put myself and a few other female hunters kind of in a room at Sitka headquarters and basically said, what do you guys want? What do you need? What kind of things are missing in your gear? And they gave us like full reign. We were able to give them all of our ideas. And from there, we started giving our feedback on the designs that they were getting back and testing the prototypes. And we went through several rounds of prototype testing. And then we all did some hunts and things like that as well to make sure it was working out good in the field. And I've spent the last 2 seasons testing the whitetail products for women.
Now, next week, we're going to hear more from Jess about what her and the team were ultimately able to develop for female hunters. But if you'd like to learn more in the meantime, you can visit sitkagear.com/women's. And now, we'll get back to the show and give Joe a call. All right, with us now on the line is Joe Shead. Thanks for joining us, Joe.
Hey, glad to be there.
We were just joking a little bit ago before you got on that we thought it, and you probably get this a lot, but it's pretty crazy that the guy that wrote the book on shed hunting has the last name Shead. Was that fate? Like, did you know from the moment you were a young child that you had to be this guy, or how did it happen?
No, I guess not. All my life everybody's called me Joe Shead, and ever since the book came around and shed hunting got popular, then people kind of get to the shed. And I think there's a guy that plays for the Seahawks with the same last name, so that helps too.
So is Shead the proper pronunciation though?
No, Shed is actually the correct pronunciation.
Okay. All right. Nice. So, have you been out shed hunting yet this year?
You know, to tell you the truth, I really haven't been out too much this year. Just this last weekend, I went out and did a little bit of scouting, and that's about it.
Nice. That's the same boat that me and Dan are in. But I imagine just like us, you're chomping at the bit. You excited to really get out there and start walking?
Well, I really am. You know, and the worst thing you can do right now is look at Facebook because it's just blowing up with all these people finding sheds, which is great, you know, but it's kind of, it is what it is. Where I live, you know, I'm in northern Minnesota here. The county I live in actually borders Canada, so we tend to get a lot of snow, although this year's been pretty mild. And I really don't like to bother the deer when there's a lot of snow. And I like to ice fish too, so that kind of gets in the way of things.
True. I've got some buddies that are the same way, and in most years I'm usually trying to pull them away from ice fishing to try to get them to go walk with me. But this year, with the warm temps we've been having, it hasn't been an issue. I'm not expecting it to be an issue probably here in the next few weeks, but we just got a big dump of snow last night, so I went from feeling really good about, you know, maybe being able to find some mid-February antlers to all of a sudden I don't know. So it'll be interesting. But I got to ask, Joe, how long have you been doing this? How'd you get into shed hunting? How long ago did this all begin for you?
Well, I guess it's probably been around 20 years. You know, when I look back, you know, the deer hunting itself has really changed. I remember when I was a kid, you know, back in the 80s, you know, going along with my dad, you know, you shot the first buck you saw. You know, there was never talk about, you know, passing up a deer or anything like that. It was just different. I mean, there were guys doing that, obviously, but it's different than it is now. And back then, it just seemed kind of crazy that a deer could live through the hunting season. And where I grew up in Wisconsin, it's like a war zone out there on opening day. And I know that's the same way in a lot of areas. And for a buck to survive long enough to grow a set of antlers and drop them and grow another set just seemed improbable back then. So, you know, as mentalities change, people passed up bucks and you know, deer hunting's gotten so incredibly popular. You know, just guys are into it year round now, and I mean, it wasn't even on the radar back then, and now it's just kind of gotten to be a major thing where everybody's doing it.
Yeah. Do you have any idea how many antlers you've found? Do you keep track of that at all, or do you know how many you typically find a year or anything along those lines?
You know, I do keep track pretty good of, as far as I like to put a tag on everyone. And what's really crazy is I can remember, I have a room in my basement that I'm started, and I got a long ways to go on it, but I've been trying to put them on shelves and organize them. And I have people come over, and I'm like, pull one off the shelf, cover the tag, and I'll tell you where I found it and what, you know, almost sometimes what day I found it and what year. And I'm pretty good about the old stuff. You know, the newer stuff I can't remember as well. But as far as a count, I really don't know. It's hard to say.
I'm pretty decent when it comes to like the bigger sheds that I have. I can remember those well, but like a spike antler or like a little forky, those I feel like get all mixed up in my head and I can't keep track of those. What about you, Dan? Do you have a mind for remembering your antlers?
Yeah, I can check out some characteristics on the antler and have a pretty good idea where I found them. Maybe not, for me, it's not the year, but I can tell you exactly where I found the antler. Probably not what year though. However, I have a bunch of those little 4-point sides that they all kind of look the same. They're probably from a 2-year-old that I probably couldn't tell you where it's from unless it has some noticeable characteristics to it.
Right. Your typical generic 4.2-year-old, those do tend to
Right.
all mix together. So, Joe, where all you shed hunted? Have you hunted other places other than your home state?
Yeah, I've done quite a bit of traveling. I had several years there where I was just able to, be self-employed and just have a lot of flexibility as far as travel went in the spring. I don't have that anymore, and I kind of miss that. But mostly across the Midwest. I've been to Saskatchewan a few times. I've been up in Alaska, Rockies. I went on a deer hunt in Alabama once on the company's dime, and I kind of got gar-holed. I was in a bad spot. I hadn't seen anything bigger than a spike in 3 days, so the last morning I climbed down early and poked around, and I managed to find a drop-tine shed down in Alabama, so that was kind of cool.
Wow.
Nice.
That's awesome. Where's your favorite place to shed hunt? What's the best state you think?
I really don't know. There's so many good areas. I mean, you look at, areas like Iowa and Illinois are obviously famous. They have a lot of deer and a lot of big antlers. Saskatchewan is incredible as far as, just the trophy class and the amount of antlers. But to be honest with you, the stuff I really like the best is the stuff right around home, because, those are the deer I know and maybe have a history with. And, you got to understand, I go out on my own turf, and if I find one shed a day, that's a good day for me, because the areas I live in don't have exceptional deer numbers. They don't have exceptional trophy potential, but it's the deer I'm familiar with, the deer I hunt, and that kind of makes it special to me.
Yeah.
So when it really starts getting good, that late February, early March, where for me historically is when I have found the most antlers. Are you pounding ground 8 hours a day, or are you, poking in for a 1 or 2 hour walk here? Next day you'll go out for a couple hours, or do you hit it hard for like 4 weeks?
I guess it kind of depends on the situation. Back in the day when I had a lot more free time, when I didn't have a real job, I'd go out pretty much every day. And I looked in some urban areas where, the deer are very visible and they're relatively tame. They see people on a daily basis, or in city parks and stuff. And kind of the name of the game with that was you got to be the first guy down the trail on the day it drops and get lucky, because, some of those areas I'd go in 3 times a week, and just a small area that, it took me a half hour to cover, but I'd just get burned out doing that over and over. And you'd go in there and you could see the deer. I mean, a lot of times I get pictures of them or videos, because they're relatively tolerant of people, and that stuff just burned me out. What I really like to do when it's game on time, I'm going to go all day, every day. I'm a weekend warrior again, but we'll do, Buddy and I'll do trips. We'll go to Montana for a week, or Idaho or something, and pound it pretty hard, and that's always a lot of fun.
When you do those western trips, are you looking for whitetail antlers or elk and muleys up in the, a little farther up in the country?
Well, it depends where we go. Out in Montana, we'll do the river bottoms in the eastern part of the state, and then it's whitetails down the river bottoms, and then you kind of get up into the foothills a little bit, get in just a little bit of elevation, get in some mule deer. We've gone higher elevation out in Idaho, where we're, each day we'll start at like maybe say roughly 5,000 feet, and we'll end up at 8,000, and then it's mule deer and elk, and that's a lot of fun. But man, that's a pounding.
I bet. This is something I'm particularly intrigued with, because I think I'm going to try to do some Rocky Mountain shed hunting for the first time this year. Is it at least on the whitetail front, when you're searching the river bottoms and stuff, is it dramatically different than shed hunting in the Midwest or something, or are you just basically trying to find the good winter food source and bedding and walking those bottoms?
Well, I've done the Montana river bottom thing a couple of times, and I don't want to say it's easy, but I think it's kind of easy compared to what I'm used to. Out there, it's so much wide open spaces. It's, there's going to be fields and stuff, but really the only cover around is going to be cottonwoods down on the river bottoms, and it's pretty easy to figure out where they're spending their time. That's the only cover available, so that's where we shed hunt. You just follow the river corridor, which makes it pretty easy.
I like the idea of easy shed hunting.
I do too.
That sounds right up my alley.
The problem is we run into a lot of competition doing that too. We're not the only guys going out there, and we'll talk to a rancher and he'll say, yeah, we had 2 groups come through here already, but we still find sheds too. So.
Oh, really? Interesting. So rewinding just a little bit, how did the book come to be? How did you end up getting the idea and the desire to write a book on shed hunting?
Well, I guess it was kind of a long process. By trade, I'm an outdoor writer. I worked for Deer and Deer Hunting magazine for a few years, and that was my full-time job. And I was kind of immersed in everything deer at that point, working on the magazine, and I'm a writer. And I really got into shed hunting, when I really, really started getting into it was the early 2000s. I'd tried, back in the 90s and stuff, and back in the good old days before everybody else was doing it. I wish I could go back, but started kicking around the idea, it was just really starting to gain popularity in the early 2000s. And I'm like, there's no book on this. I should write a book. And I kind of toyed with the idea for a while. And I knew, you start writing a book, you start publicizing it, you're kind of cutting your own throat, because the next thing you know, you're going to find footprints where you'd like to shed hunt. And that really kind of made me balk for a while. And I probably sat on the idea for about a year. And I finally got to the point where I kind of was, doing a pro and con thing, and realized that, it's something I really enjoy. And the first thing that I like to do when I find a good fishing spot, or when I find a good shad hunting spot, I always want to bring a friend, not not somebody that's going to, mess me up and come back without me, but a good friend, and,
Right.
and share that experience. You got to pick and choose. I know.
Mm-hmm.
I've been burned before, but, I come back there, and it's more enjoyable with a friend, or just to see the look on somebody's face when they find a shed. And I kind of realized as well, I figured if I didn't, somebody would at some point anyway. And looking back over the last decade or so, it's just gained so much popularity. You look at the Facebook pages, there's a bunch of different Facebook pages dedicated to it that weren't around back in the day. And it's gone so mainstream,
Yeah, like you said, it was probably inevitable. There was so much momentum building up, regardless of if you put a book out or not. Probably, like you said, someone would be putting out that information. But do your friends ever give you crap when your good shed hunting spots get picked up by other people?
Well, I know there's people that I'm sure wouldn't appreciate me publicizing the sport, but there's been so many people doing it over the last few years, and it's really getting hard. I have a couple spots I will not go to in the wintertime when there's snow on the ground, because I won't leave a track. And I've gotten burned. I've told a couple of people and brought them in there, and then next thing you know, they're bringing their friends and without you, and that kind of made me mad a little bit. And you just got to kind of pick and choose. And I tend to be willing to show people stuff if they're good friends of mine, but I got a couple of spots I won't take anybody.
I got a question for you. Now, I like to shed hunt a lot, but I really only like to shed hunt pieces of property where I can keep the sheds. Now, I've been invited to several other farms where the guy's like, hey, you want to come shed hunting with me? And but at the end of the day, I'd like to have those sheds. Well, for me, that just seems like a waste of time, because I feel that I have enough ground to pound on my end, to go and keep that shed, which kind of leads me to these set of rules that I was taught by another group of guys that I used to shed hunt, and Mark's shed hunted with me before, and so he kind of knows them. But the rules are, number one, if you find it, you get to keep it. Number two, if, let's say, I find the first shed and Mark finds the matching set, Mark gives up that side so the set can stay together. And then the other rule, the very last rule, is if somebody kills that deer, so let's say Mark has the matching set or just one of the antlers, and I kill the deer, he gives them up so all the antlers are with the deer. Do you have any type of unwritten rules that you live by when it comes to shed hunting?
I guess I don't, Dan. That's kind of exactly what you said is basically kind of the unwritten rule that I have heard and usually go by. I don't end up in that situation a lot. I have a good friend named Dan Hess who I shed hunt with, and I know that we've found in the past one of us will find one antler and then the other guy will get the match, and then we usually do give it up. So I think that what you said is pretty much right, but it depends on the given circumstances. And you start to get a really special shed. Maybe it's a 80 or 90 inch shed. It's awful hard for that second guy to give it up when he knows the first guy's got, especially if they don't know each other. I mean, if you're helping a guy look to match that deer up, that's one thing. But if you just find it, on your own, then it's a little sticky.
Right. And I guess all those rules are, addressed up front when, either I go hunting, shed hunting with somebody, or somebody comes shed hunting with me.
You know, and I don't ask people to give it up. To me, it's their choice. It doesn't mean that much unless I say, hey, we're specifically looking for this deer. You know, if they find something else that I have a match to and they want to keep it, you know, I've got enough sheds, maybe. But you know, I feel bad about asking. You know, it's like if it was something where I said, hey, I'm specifically looking for this deer, then it's kind of understood. But otherwise, you know, I'm pretty lenient. I mean, I hate to take a shed from somebody.
Right. Yeah, we've actually started nixing that rule with some of my buddies this past year, just because, especially if you don't, you know, like you said, Joe, if it's a buck, you know, and you really want to find those antlers, you know, we're all about giving those antlers to that guy if it's his property or something. But otherwise, like, I don't know. I know, Dan, you're really big on the antlers should be together and the match set belongs a match set. I get that, and that's cool. But at the same time, I also know, like, if it's random antlers and the only antler you find one day or that day, if such and such finds this antler, he's super pumped about it, and then a minute later, such and such finds that one antler, and that's the only antler he finds that day, and you were both really pumped to find this antler, and then all of a sudden you have to give it up. I'm kind of like, at least for me now, I think I've decided that, you know, unless it's like a deer I'm personally after, if it's just a random match, I'm like, you know what, just keep it. Right. Because, gosh, you spend so much time out there walking and you get that little burst of excitement. It's kind of a major bummer to then take that little burst of excitement away. But, you know, to your point, I think it's just a good idea to have that conversation up front and make sure everyone's on the same page. And, you know, as long as there's not this, like, presumption and then all of a sudden someone's got an antler in the hand and you go walking up to them and say, hey, give it to me. That's when things get a little ugly. So it's good to have those conversations early. Joe, I want to take a step back again, and I'm curious, can you tell us a little bit about the antler shedding process? I know you mentioned that in your book a little bit, and that's something we haven't talked about before here. Can you just talk a little bit about how that happens, when that happens specifically, like why that happens?
Sure. I did a lot of research on that, you know, when I was writing the book, and basically kind of it comes down to as the light levels decrease in the fall, going into midwinter, buck's testosterone levels start to drop. And that's kind of what puts everything in motion. And as those testosterone levels drop, these cells called osteoclasts, if you want to really get technical, start forming at the base of the pedicle where the antler attaches to the head. And what happens eventually, they kind of devour that calcium. An antler is mostly made of calcium and phosphorus. And what happens is the calcium kind of starts to get reabsorbed into the skull. And so that's why why the base of a shed is kind of rough, that sandpapery texture. That's they call them spicules of calcium getting pulled back into the skull. And eventually when those strands get too weak, the antler just drops off.
And is there... Sorry, continue.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to add, you know, what's kind of baffling, though, I mean, you know, bucks can start dropping as early as late November and as late as May. So it's a long, drawn-out process. You know, generally most bucks are going to shed between probably December and March, and it seems to be a seasonal or an area-specific thing to some extent. Some areas they drop earlier than later. But it's kind of baffling, you know, if testosterone levels are the root cause of it, why do some antlers drop, you know, so early, and why are some so late? I mean, there's a lot of mysteries we really don't know about it yet.
And are there any other like external factors? I've heard of some different external factors, but do you know of any that can cause antlers to drop earlier or later, weather or health or anything like that you've seen or researched?
Yeah, well, health definitely can play a role too. A lot of times I know if a buck is injured or, you know, if it gets shot or hit by a car or something, a lot of times those bucks will drop early. You know, if he's not getting enough food, he might be a little bit stressed. Weather, people always talk about weather stressing deer, and you know, there's probably some truth to that, but we've seen some awful severe winters where, I mean, it's prolonged below zero temperatures and deep snow, and I'll still see deer carrying into March. So I'm not really sure about that. And, the question always comes up, do the big bucks drop first or the little bucks? And, I think to some extent maybe the big bucks do drop first, but, there's so many exceptions that you really can't get a hard and fast rule out of any of it.
Yeah. Sorry, Dan, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I talked to one of my buddies who's a deer farmer, Sam Calora, and he told me that I think it's February, he will feed, he has his deer and he feeds them. And then I think he said this, don't quote me, but come late February or early March, he will starve them for like remove food for, I think, 4 or 5 days. And he says, without a doubt, most of the antlers fall off in that time period because of what I'm assuming is the stress from being hungry. So I don't know if, that's just repeated, basically regurgitated information. Don't quote me on that, but I wonder how much winter stress is the actual cause of the shedding process.
It's a fascinating story. It's, and I can see that being true, but it's hard to say, but that would certainly make sense.
Yeah, interesting. Another thing I saw you'd written, Joe, that related to this issue of timing that I found pretty interesting is that you'd mentioned that you'd heard somewhere or read something or something along the lines of that many bucks tend to drop their antlers at the same time of year every year, like within a few days. Is that the case?
Yeah, I ran across something in the scientific research. I was going through a lot of scientific stuff when I wrote it, and there was cases where it's pen deer, so they could study them closely, and it seemed to be pretty much basically the same day that they would shed each year, within a few days.
That's there's all these weird factors. Like to your point, Dan, there could be like this external stress factor, but then there's also like this what should be consistent testosterone relationship to daylight factor, and then there's also like, is there some kind of genetic factor? Because if there's like a consistent, unique date for an individual buck, like, man, I think like you said earlier, Joe, there's lots of mysteries here, and I guess that
we all talk about. We always talk about an annual pattern for deer movement. So one could assume that if they're on a pattern like, okay, this buck leaves my farm in September but comes back the last week of October every year, I would think that shedding could be part of that annual pattern as well.
Yeah,
makes sense.
Yeah. So with all this kind of with all these questions around the timing of antler drop, do you have a consistent date or time frame, Joe, when you think it is the best time to start shed hunting, or does it depend, based on some of these different conditions for you of when you start?
Well, for me, I prefer to actually go after the snow is melted. I like looking on the bare ground better than in the snow. So if I can, I usually try to time it after the fact. I start chomping at the bit. I start kind of getting that itch too. Weather patterns make a difference too. We had a kind of a January thaw here where we lost, a lot of the snow that we did have, and then we just got 3 inches of snow yesterday, so that kind of affects things. But usually I don't usually get out till, I don't usually start hitting it pretty hard till March, and that's just my personal preference. Not that there's not antlers out there to be found right now, and some guys might prefer walking in the snow. If there's a lot of snow, they're either going to be right on the trails, or they're going to be in a bed, or they might be out in the field someplace. But it kind of narrows it down. I find when I'm walking on snow, when I'm going down a heavy deer trail, it's like you can really fly because they're right there. You don't have to be scanning so much to the side. They're either going to be right there or they're not. So, I guess it just kind of depends on the individual and what you're seeing in your area. I talk to people in different areas. A guy told me in northern Illinois or northern Iowa, the deer are already shed early, December. Same thing out in Montana, they drop early. And then I talked to some guys in different areas, and everything's holding tight till the end of February, early March. So, if you're seeing bucks as you're driving around or got trail cam images, if they're still holding, I mean, it doesn't really pay to get out.
You mentioned that you do some scouting. What does that entail, like your pre-shed hunting scouting? Is it just doing a quick walk, or is it glassing, or what are you doing there and why?
Well, a lot of times it's, I don't really do a whole lot of scouting for deer anymore. What I would do is, if there are fields available, I drive around fields at night and try to see where the deer are or what they're doing. The scouting I was talking about, actually really got into looking for moose sheds in the last couple of years. It's kind of really been where I've been putting my effort. And I was out this weekend hiking around trying to just establish where they're at so that I can come back in the spring, because where I was looking, the snow was beyond my knees. So it's going to be pretty hard to find sheds. I was on snowshoes. I was able to stay on top of it, but moose drop earlier, usually December, a lot of them, and so most of those sheds are going to be buried. I didn't find any, so I said I was scouting, but it helps you have a good starting point. In our area where there is snow, where there's antlers are going to be buried, you can come in there in the spring, and then you'll have a good idea where you should begin.
Yeah.
Do you get a lot of rodent chew? So, everybody wants to find the perfect shed. It hasn't been chewed on by mice or squirrels or anything like that. Are you ever, if you're looking for a particular buck, are you ever worried about like rodents chewing on them, or is that a problem up there in Minnesota?
Well, it's certainly not a huge problem here compared to areas. I know areas that have a lot of oak trees and a lot of squirrels, where they got gray squirrels and fox squirrels. That's where you really get your damage, I think. So if you've got oak woods on your property, you're going to want to hit those early and often. And I always tell people, if that's the situation, hit the oak woods repeatedly, hit them early, and then the fields you can leave till later, because nothing should bother them out there. Here we have red squirrels, and they do chew on antlers, but not really to the extent that the fox squirrels and gray squirrels will. So I do find some chews. I'll find gnaws on antlers from coyotes or wolves, and I got one that was just a beautiful shed a few years ago that had like 6-inch mass measurements that
Wow.
was just chomped in half by either a bear or a wolf. That's all I can figure. It wasn't chewed by a squirrel. It was chomped.
That's crazy. This whole issue of like when to get out there is always one that I'm always struggling with, because I feel like it's a balancing act between, if you go too late, you risk, this thing we just talked about, you risk antlers getting chewed on, or you risk other people getting out there and scooping up the sheds first. But if you go too early, you could be out there in the snow and have buried sheds, or you could, if you go in there too much, you could end up spooking bucks away from these areas, and then, they drop their antlers on your neighbor. So that's always like this weird balancing act I find myself trying to play, is like figuring out when's like the best time where most of the antlers are on the ground, but I'm not so late that I'm going to be missing out on them. That seems to require a certain level of scouting, whether it be the trail cameras or, like you said, glassing fields and stuff, to try to figure out right when the buck you're after, or most of the bucks are dropping. But like you said, it's always different. So I don't have a good answer for that either.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. People ask and they want you to point to a day on the calendar, and you kind of got to be like a politician. You got to kind of give them a muddy answer, because there is no absolute answer. All those factors you mentioned, is it public ground or private ground? Is there snow? Is there not snow? Are there squirrels or are there not squirrels? And that all kind of comes into play. Have they dropped, or are they still carrying? You got to kind of weigh all those factors, like you said, and make your decision based on that.
Mm-hmm. So for someone who hasn't gone shed hunting before, I don't know if there's any of those types of people listening to this podcast, but if there is, Joe, what kind of like equipment or things do they need to think about bringing with them, or thinking about before going shed hunting? Do you have some basic stuff that you always prepare before a shed hunt?
Well, my friends who know me know that I'm notoriously light on gear. I usually just go for a walk with what's in my pocket, my cell phone, and that's about it. And about 2 hours into it, I'm wishing I would have brought some food or something. But, really just a good pair of hiking boots is, all you really need. And then you can go from there, GPS, or are you going to need a backpack? Are you going to find a bunch of sheds? You know, are you going to need food and water? That's always usually a good thing to bring, you know, depending on how long you're going to be out there. But then it just depends on your situation. You know, binoculars can be good if you're in, say, you're glassing out in a soybean field or alfalfa field or something like that. If you're in a wooded area where I do a lot of my shed hunting, I never use binoculars there because they're not practical. You know, cameras, but everybody's got a phone these days because everybody wants to take a picture of the shed as they found it, which is cool. And then it just depends from there. You know, you might be riding an ATV across a soybean field or something, or it just kind of gets into the specialized situations. But you really don't need a lot of gear, but you make do with what you need.
Yeah, I'll add toilet paper. Make sure you bring.
Yes. How did I forget that?
Or you walk out of the woods with one sleeve on your shirt.
Exactly.
How did I forget that? See, I forgot that when we're talking. It means I forget it when I'm shed hunting too.
Yeah, you never want to be in that position. All right, so we're ready to go shed hunting. We brought our TP and our boots. I'm curious, Joe, when you start out on a property, do you have like a plan in place to attack that property on that day? Like, do you know, okay, I'm going to go to A, this spot, and B, that spot, and C, this spot? Or do you just start walking willy-nilly? Like, what's your process of breaking down a property?
Well, you know, some of that's where your scouting comes into play. If you've been driving around and seeing deer at night in fields or have trail camera pics, you know, you kind of know where the deer are, where wintering. And, you know, that can change seasonally. They might be in a different spot in January than they were during a hunting season. You need to remember that. But as far as that, it comes down to, one, figuring out, you know, the productive ground, and two, trying to eliminate the unproductive ground. You know, there's going to just be areas of a property that aren't really going to hold deer. I always think of a spot I like to shed hunt, and there's a little ash forest in there, and they just don't seem to spend any time in there. And so if I can eliminate that ground, I can kind of say, okay, I'm going to focus most of my time on the more productive ground. So I'll just try to hit you know, it depends on how much time you have too. I mean, if I've got all day to dedicate to it, you know, I can take the liberty to, you know, hit the best spots first and then kind of just go down the list from there. But if I've only got a couple hours, I'm going to try to go right to the very best spot I've got and maximize my time.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. That seems to be what a lot of the best shed hunters I know do. It's really prioritize those best spots, spend the majority of your time there, and you know, if you can focus more time in the good spots, then you're definitely going to have a higher percentage of success. But then that naturally leads to the question of what are the best spots? So what do you view as productive ground? What kind of things are you looking for?
Well, you know, in the simplest terms, I mean, deer are going to be either bedding, feeding, or traveling between those two areas in the wintertime. So you can kind of narrow it down to those three types of things. You know, it might be farm fields, it might be haystacks, it could be, you know, just forest browse, it could be the feeding areas, bedding areas. It could be good thick cover, it could be some conifers, you know, some pine trees or something that provides some shelter from the wind. Catches the snow, holds it up in the branches. But what a lot of people don't realize, too, is that sometimes the best bedding cover is a lack of cover, and that's where the south-facing hillsides come into play. That's always a really good spot to look for sheds because that's the area that gets the most direct sunlight in the winter. And you'll find if you're in a snowy region like I live, the north slope will have a lot more snow than the south side because the sun's beating down and melting it. And a deer is a lot like a cat. It likes to, you know, like a cat sitting in a window, soaking up that sunlight. A deer is going to do the same thing. It's trying to survive. It's, you know, it's trying to conserve body heat, and a lot of times they'll bed on that south slope. Sometimes east slope as well, trying to take advantage of that morning sun too. So those are things I look for, I guess, in general. You know, good food sources, south slope of hills. You know, bedding areas that might be, you know, thick cover like pine trees, like I said, or thick brush. It just kind of depends.
You know,
do you focus ever on like fence crossings or creek crossings, or I guess where do you typically find a majority of your sheds?
Yeah, well, the fence and creek thing, as you mentioned, I'm sure you know, is they're jumping that obstacle, the fence or the creek, and on impact they can lose an antler. And I have found sheds laying right in creeks before. Everybody talks about the fence crossing. I've actually only found very few sheds at fence crossings, but they do occur. I guess I don't look a lot of along the fence lines. Fence lines either. But most of my sheds, and it comes down to the areas I search too. Where I live, we don't have agricultural fields, so everything is looking in the forest. So then, your food source really can be pretty much anywhere. It's not a really defined area. So as a shed hunter, I kind of am a bed-oriented person. I look for deer beds. I look for areas where they're, either a defined bed in one particular spot or maybe like a ridge line where they're going to bed all along that ridge. That's kind of how I look. And I know I've shed hunted with other people, and we have different styles, and it kind of comes down to what we're used to. Guys that are more agricultural areas are going to be more likely to, look those field edges or whatever. And, you kind of start with what you know, but you should be willing to adapt to different situations as well.
Right.
Yeah, speaking of like locations, one on the bedding area side of things, one kind of just randomly popped in my head that and I got to say, Joe, taking a step back here, when I first got into shed hunting, I don't know, 8 years ago or 9 years ago or whatever it was now, I did pick up your book and I read it, and it definitely helped me. And I think I read this in your book originally, and now I've seen it play out in my own life time and time again. When you're on a hillside or in a forest or something, and you have like an individual conifer tree, an evergreen tree by itself, I've seen so many times that those are the spots where a buck will bed, and you find a shed there. That little cedar tree or something by itself and some tall grass or something. I always zoom over to those locations if ever I see one, because that seems to be like one of those little wild card spots, kind of where it's like the spot within the spot. Like it's a bedding area, but then that specific spot within the bedding area tends to be that isolated bedding tree or something. Do you find that kind of thing still too?
Yeah, you definitely nail it right on the head. If I could pick out like my ideal spot to find a shed, it would be like a one lone conifer tree in a hardwood forest on a south slope of a hill. And if you think about it, trappers are really good at reading the landscape. You think about your own hunting situation. How many times have you been walking through the woods where it's maybe hardwoods or something? There's one big tall white pine in that hardwoods, and guess what? Somebody's got a stand hanging in that tree. It stands out. I mean, people relate to it. Animals relate to it. You'll find bones underneath these trees where a fox or a coyote has sat there and just chewed on a bone. I mean, it's something that sticks out from the landscape. And it's not just deer that pick up on it, but yeah, you're absolutely right. Those bucks will go out of their way to bed underneath that lone tree or just a few scattered pines here and there in an otherwise hardwood forest.
Yeah, the issue with those spots is that they really stand out visually. So like when there's a group of like 3 or 4 of us walking through the woods, we all see that little cluster of cedars or something. You can tell everyone's pace picks up and everyone wants to get there first. I wish that wasn't so well known now. But it's funny how so many times like you can, or at least obviously it's the vast minority of the time, but lots of times you can call it. You can see these spots coming up and you're like, okay, if we're going to find a shed on this property, it's probably going to be in this little patch or underneath these couple trees or something. And so many times, I mean, it does happen. So it's interesting how these patterns emerge. Like you said, it's just like understanding how deer relate to cover from a hunting standpoint. They relate to these certain things and features, when we're trying to look for their antlers, because it's just basically where do they bed? Where are they spending their time? Because that's where they end up dropping these. So it's interesting to see.
One thing I was going to say too is like it kind of goes in line with your deer hunting too. When I started deer hunting, I learned what I could and I did what I just thought was natural and read books and magazines and watched shows and stuff. But you start shed hunting, and in order to be successful at shed hunting, it really forces you to understand how these deer relate to the landscape, how they travel, and why they travel where they're at. And the more shed hunting you do, the more you'll become a better deer hunter. And nowadays, when I walk the woods, I can just kind of look in some areas and say, they're going to be here and they're not going to be there, and I can come in there in the springtime and I know that without seeing tracks in the snow or anything, because, you just kind of develop a feel for it. I'm not saying I'm right all the time because I've certainly been wrong before, but you really develop a feel for how deer travel, and it's really going to benefit you during hunting season as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask how much you think shed hunting helps with your actual hunting. Is there anything else that you pay attention to while you shed hunt that you try to apply back to the hunting season? Like, do you take, let's say you find the antlers of a buck that you'd be interested in hunting the next year. Do you take that into account the next year when hunting him? Do you think that's applicable at all or anything like that?
Oh, absolutely. And it depends on your area. Where I live, a lot of the deer will shift around seasonally between fall and winter, so they're not necessarily going to be in the same spot. But depending on your geographic region, I mean, absolutely, it plays into account.
Yeah, I think to your point, it just depends on if that deer behavior changes dramatically post-season or from the season to post-season. But yeah, I've seen some situations where you find sheds and you get a good idea of where they're spending their time in the late season, and that's definitely applicable if you've got a hunting season that goes into late December or early January, that kind of thing. So definitely helpful. So we know to focus on these types of spots, focus on the productive regions, bedding areas, feeding areas, travel corridors between the two. But when you're actually out there walking, what kind of advice do you have for people to actually help you see more sheds and actually spot more sheds? Because it's one thing to know where you should be looking. It's another thing to actually find them. How do you get better at that?
Okay, that's a good question. Well, the first thing, and it sounds simple, but I always tell people to keep their eyes on the ground, because the first couple of times that I go out for the year, I'll be seeing deer. I'll be in deer hunting mode. I'll be looking 3 feet off the ground trying to see a deer when I need to keep my eyes on the ground. And it's something you really have to consciously tell yourself. I'll go out with a buddy and he'll be like, "Did you see that rub?" And I'll be like, "What rub?" Because I wasn't looking that high. It's not that extreme all the time. I mean, I certainly see rubs and stuff, but you really need to be looking at the ground. And that's where they're going to be. And it sounds simple, but until what people always talk about, throwing an antler out and looking for it. Or if you're with a buddy and he finds a shed, maybe he doesn't touch it and you come and find it. And until you kind of get in that situation, it's kind of like catching a fish. Until you feel that how a walleye bites, then you kind of understand it. And once you find that first shed, then something seems to click. And all of a sudden, after that, it becomes easier. Same thing, the first shed of the year, it always seems to be hard because you're just not in that zone. And once you see it, it clicks in your mind. And then you start realizing, it's like, okay, I'm looking for tines sticking up out of the grass. And, it might not be a whole antler. It might be something behind a log or buried in grass or something. You're maybe just looking for a couple of inches of that tine sticking out. And you start to kind of train your eye to see it and develop a feel for what you should really be looking for.
Is there a weather condition that you really like to hunt in, to shed hunt in?
Well, but everybody else says the cloudy days are best because you're not squinting, and after rain because it mats down the grass and the leaves and makes a little bit of a shine on the antler. Everybody talks about that, but it is hard to look into the sunshine. You certainly want to keep the sun at your back if you can. I guess I go whenever I can, but ideally, a cloudy day after a rain would be the best conditions.
All right, Joe, sunglasses or no sunglasses?
I don't really wear sunglasses very often when I'm shed hunting, and it's just a total matter of personal preference. Everybody's got their own, opinions of what's best for them. And one thing about the sunglasses, when you're in a brushy area, it's probably not a bad idea to be wearing them, because I know I've had so many sticks jabbed in my face before that, I'm just lucky that I haven't poked my eye or something, but it's just all on personal preference.
Yeah, I struggle with that because I like on those bright days where, you're squinting and your eyes hurt, I want to put sunglasses on, but I have this like voice in the back of my head that says like something with like the lens is tinting your ability to see the sheds. They're not going to pop out to you as much. So I start wondering, like, am I hurting my ability to see these things? So I'm like trying them on, trying them off, squinting, not squinting. What's worse? I find myself getting crazy sometimes.
Well, you can find them with sunglasses. You can find them without sunglasses. So I guess it's just whatever you like best.
True. Maybe I should wear sunglasses so then I just have something to blame for why I don't find sheds, and I'll feel better about it. Yeah.
Excuses are always good.
Yeah. What about like, do you have any like specific? And I know this is going to depend on like the amount of cover or terrain, but like if you're walking a property by yourself, let's say, like what's the spacing? Like how many times do you need to walk through an area? Is like every 10 yards, is every 40 or 50 yards that you need to space to try to say, like, to know that you covered a spot well? Do you have any like generic typical gaps that you tend to walk an area to cover it?
Well, I guess it really depends on, and that's, I feel like a broken record here. It depends on so many things, every situation depends. If you're walking out in a picked cornfield or something like that, you might be taking, just a few rows at a time. And, the thicker the cover, the tighter the pass is. If I'm in the woods or something or walking a ridge line, I'm probably just going to walk that ridge line once, maybe a couple of times. I'll usually walk that south face and sometimes the north face too, a little bit more towards the top. But it just depends on the cover, how thick it is. If you're in oak woods, it's relatively open. You can see farther, and if you're in some real tight brush, some dogwood or something like that, you're going to need to make some tighter passes. So yeah, everything depends.
Yeah, very true. Another thing I've sometimes done and heard other people suggest is trying to find like different perspectives. Like even if you've walked through an area once and it seems like you saw everything, like sometimes it's a good idea to stand on top of a stump or kneel down and look around. Do you ever do that kind of thing just to try to see things at a different angle or anything?
Yeah. A lot of guys talk about walking behind or looking behind them once in a while as well. And sometimes you'll see a shed that you walked right by, maybe the sun was in your eyes or there was a branch in your way or something that caused you to not be able to see it. But sometimes, I've certainly found sheds that I've walked within feet of, and I came back, on another pass through there just, by chance or whatever, and here that antler was laying right there. It was maybe, behind a fallen log or something like that. Or maybe sometimes you just were looking left when you should have been looking right, That's another consideration is how fast you walk. I always try to not walk faster than my eyes can see. If you're sweeping back and forth, left and right with your eyes, if you're looking left, you got to make sure that you're not walking so fast that you haven't had a time to bring that vision back to the right before you keep moving. And again, if it's real open terrain, you can walk a little faster, and if it's tight woodsy cover, then you need to walk a little slower.
Yeah, that's a good point. Do you ever walk a whole property or whole section twice, or like come back a week later specifically because of this fact that you're inevitably probably going to miss some?
Oh, definitely. Especially if you're really looking for a particular shed. Sometimes you just flat out miss them, and you'll find a shed that, we were within, a few feet of it before, and somehow you just missed it. Or, I've even, people, it sounds ridiculous, but I'm out there looking for sheds. I've stepped on sheds. I've kicked sheds, and you'd think you'd see those. But, I'll definitely come back, especially if there's something I'm really looking for. And like you were saying earlier, sometimes it's a good idea to come from a different angle and see things from a different perspective too. So, or bring a buddy along and maybe they'll see something in a different way that something that you missed.
Yeah, very true. Well, Dan, do you have
What's the biggest? Yeah, I got a question. What's the biggest shed you've ever found?
Well, I haven't really found a whole lot of real big sheds, to tell you the truth. Most of the bulk of the sheds I find are from, yearling bucks or 2-year-old bucks, just because that's mostly what's around. The biggest one I've ever got was a 78-inch shed I found up in Saskatchewan at Bentley Cobins, and that's the one that's on the cover of my book. And that was 2006, and I haven't beaten it.
Well, that's a heck of a shed.
Yeah.
That is a giant shed.
It was a nice shed.
That's awesome. What's your
What
biggest
did mine? I think it's sitting right above me in my office. I can't remember if it's 77 or 74 inches.
It's a good shed.
What was that one you found on the the property that one day when we were hunting.
Yeah, that's still my biggest. I think that was 64.5 inches. Is that right?
60, sounds like
I
it.
think that's what it was.
Right.
So what were you gonna ask though, dude?
So that was your biggest. Now, what's the most you found in one day?
The most I've ever found in one day was 20.
Jeez.
And, the sad part is the guy I was shed hunting with that day found 30.
My
Wow.
Lord. I've only had one day of shed hunting, and it was a day I didn't bring a backpack, where I had to leave a pile. I found 11. I think that was my best day, and nothing worth bragging about from a size standpoint. But I remember having to make a pile at a fence opening and then continue the walk, and then hopefully on my way back I had to stop at the truck and then go all the way back because it was just awkward to carry them all.
It's a good problem to have.
I know. It wasn't 20 though.
No. Oh my gosh, I'd like have a heart attack, I think, if I ended a day with 20 sheds. That's insane. Are you willing to share what state that was?
Yeah, that was in Saskatchewan.
Yep.
Saskatchewan.
And yeah, the kicker was that day. I'd found 6 all day, and we just got into another area where the guy I was with had found some sheds. He said, "Let's go over there for the last hour of the day." And I didn't have a backpack. We're only going to be out for an hour. I found 14 in an hour. And I had 3 mule deer sheds that were actually all from the same buck. I had the set from the mule deer and then a previous side for that buck, and he was about a 70-inch. They were about 70-inch sides, and I had a spike shoved in my pocket. I had a couple of yearling buck antlers in my pockets. I had brow tine, antlers hanging from the brow tines on my pockets and my belt loops, and I had them all carried in front of me because I didn't have a backpack, and it was a sight to see. It was a fun hour.
Yeah, I bet.
Have you shed hunted in Saskatchewan a lot?
I've been up there 3 times. I've always gone with Bentley Coben, and it's amazing, like the number of sheds and the trophy potential. That's where the Hanson buck came from, and it's just tremendous potential up there for both trophy, size, and numbers, and it's really something.
Now, I've heard this from some of my buddies who they travel to go shed hunting, but they don't necessarily have the rodent problem up in certain parts of Canada, so they're not going to get chewed on. And they were telling me that they went on a 4-day shed hunt once, and they stumbled across this old alfalfa field, and they found, I think it was like 32 sheds. Like no one had shed hunted this area for several years, and they found like 32 sheds on this on this one field, and they found multiple years of the same buck. So I think they said they found 3 matching deer, and then you look at them, you see the characteristics, and they believe that to be the same buck for 3 years in a row, all dropped in this field. Have you ever ran into a scenario like that?
Where'd you say that field was?
Yeah.
I think they said it was either in Saskatchewan or Alberta.
Oh, that's pretty awesome.
Really,
yeah,
pretty far north.
I found, like I was saying earlier when I found out that the big mule deer match sets, they were 10 feet apart, and the one side from the previous year was 100 yards away. I found a buddy of mine, Dan Hess, when we were out in Montana one year, he found 3 years in a row on the same, 3 left sides in a row on the same walk, all within like 100 or 200 yards. I found one buck had shed under the same tree 2 years in a row. So
Wow.
It certainly happens. I don't know if it's common or not, but yeah, it certainly does happen.
And that would be pretty awesome to find. Man.
One last question about like the crazy things. How often have you, let's say you scoured an area, right? And you're like, okay, I'm sure I have found a shed every shed off this property. It's maybe March, even late March. And then the next year you come back and you find a year-old shed.
Yeah, it definitely happens. Sometimes it seems unbelievable that you could spend that much time looking and not find them, but it certainly happens. And, those saving graces, the following year, they start to bleach out in the sun a little bit, so they do get whiter and they do get a little bit easier to see. But it is amazing how hard you can look and not find an antler.
I hate that. It's like, how is this possible that we didn't find this antler? There's man, shed hunting is like, I have a love-hate relationship with it. Like, there's so much exciting and awesome about it, but then there's so many things that can be frustrating about it, and you're like, oh my gosh, I've walked for 20 hours, my feet are bleeding, how come I haven't seen a single shed? And then my buddy, who's like 30 yards away, has found like 10 of them. Like, I feel like it's one of those weird things where even if you're doing everything right, sometimes there's definitely a big piece of luck involved, that it's sometimes going to be going in your favor, and sometimes it's just not going to happen.
Absolutely. And I've gone out, with guys that are good shed hunters, and, a couple guys will have a really good day and one guy gets skunked. And I know that guy's a good shed hunter, and sometimes that guy's me. But, there's definitely a luck factor.
Yeah, that's the truth. So, Joe, we're wrapping up on time here, but if there's one single thing that you want to either add that we haven't talked about yet, or that you want to reiterate for our listeners, like the single most important thing to help people find more sheds, what would that one thing you'd want to leave people with?
Well, I think, do some scouting, find out where the bucks are hanging, and make sure you're in an area with bucks. If you're looking on public ground that's heavily hunted, it's an uphill battle because there's just not going to be a lot of bucks. And then when you get on that good piece of ground, look for those lone evergreen trees, look for south-facing hillsides, and that's a real good start to find some sheds.
I'd certainly agree. So if people want to pick up your book or learn more about what you've got going on, is there anywhere they can find that online?
Yeah, they can go to my website, goshedhunting.com, or they can Go Shed Hunting on Facebook.
Perfect. We will make sure to link that. And I think on that note, I'm about ready to go shed hunting myself. So thank you, Joe, for taking this time with us and sharing everything you learned.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, guys.
And that will be it for us today. Real quick, though, I want to give you all a little update. We recorded this original interview a few days ago, but last night, that bill we talked about in the beginning to sell off 3.3 million acres of public lands, it was taken out of consideration and killed, and it happened because of you guys. Hunters and anglers and climbers and campers and all sorts of other outdoor enthusiasts, we all rallied together on this one, and all those emails and phone calls and social media posts, it all made a difference. And I'm really encouraged by this. I think it's a great example of what we can do in the outdoor community when we come together and let our voice be heard for the good of our wildlife and our wild places. But I also just want to remind you, too, that this is just a small battle in a much bigger war against our public lands. There are going to be many, many more bills and proposals like this coming down the pipeline. As our current sitting Congress has it in their public list of priorities to sell off our public lands. So be sure to keep your ear to the ground, and when you hear more attempts like this, give them hell and let these politicians know that public lands belong in public hands. And with that, we will now officially wrap it up by thanking our partners that help keep this podcast on the air. So thanks to Sitka Gear, Yeti Coolers, Ozonics, Redneck Blinds, Maven Optics, Whitetail Institute of North America, Carbon Express, and Huntera Maps. And finally, thank you for being with us today. Thanks for giving a damn about hunting and our wildlife and our wild places. And thank you for staying wired to hunt.
I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the old ceremonial hunting tradition of eating the heart out of the first animal you kill. Meat from those organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. You can get those same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And remember, use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase. You ever get that feeling the walls closing in, the concrete jungle suffocating you? You crave some wide open spaces, the chance to connect with nature, maybe in a spot all your own. Well, head over to land.com They've got ranches, forests, mountains, streams, you name it. Search by acreage. You can search by location. You can search by the kind of hunting and fishing you're dreaming of. Land.com. It is where the adventure begins.